Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden. And this episode, I'm going to break from our usual format to launch a special two-part series. Never done this before. It concerns the sudden spike of teenage boys who are seeking to transition to being girls. Now, longtime listeners will remember that last year we invited journalist Abigail Schreier onto the program, right after she published her book called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Abigail wrote about a similar phenomenon she saw happening among teenage girls. Well, apparently it's happening among boys too. But first, before we start, let's be clear about what we are not talking about. That is, adults who make the decision to change their sex, be it to male or female. That's their right. That's their own business. And like any other minority group, they should not face discrimination based on this decision. And obviously, the world is changing to affirm their truth. What we are talking about is something quite different and new. As Abigail described it, as it pertains to teenage girls, she wrote, "Until just a few years ago, gender dysphoria, or severe discomfort in one's biological sex, was vanishingly rare. It was typically found in less than 0.01% of the population, emerged in early childhood, and afflicted males almost exclusively. But today, whole groups of female friends in colleges, high schools, and even middle schools across the country are coming out as transgender. These are girls who had never experienced any discomfort in their biological sex until they heard a coming out story from a speaker at a school assembly or discovered the internet community of trans influencers. Unsuspecting parents are awakening to find their daughters enthralled to hip trans YouTube stars and gender-affirming educators and therapists who push life-changing interventions on young girls, including medically unnecessary double mastectomies and puberty blockers that can cause permanent infertility." End quote. This same phenomenon is now occurring among boys. Recently, a group of parents reached out to me, hoping to shed a similar light on their concerns. They formed a national organization, or support group really, to help each other understand what is going on with their sons and daughters, and also to challenge the therapeutic professionals and trans activists who push for early hormonal and surgical interventions in their children, against whom they increasingly feel helpless. I just want to stress, these parents are not bigots or religious fundamentalists who oppose or don't believe in the very idea of transgenderism, although of course there may be a few of those. For the most part, these are compassionate, educated, and loving parents who don't want their sons or daughters to make irreversible medical decisions before they have matured to adults. But because of the current taboo of even raising questions about transgenderism or sexual identity, lest you be called intolerant or worse, these parents have been driven into silence and anonymity. And that, honestly, may be the strangest aspect of this phenomenon. In my 4 decades of journalism, I've never encountered an issue, really any issue, that couldn't be debated or discussed in the open, at least in a free democracy. But as you'll hear, the parents who've agreed to come on the podcast are doing so anonymously and trusting me to protect their identities. And I'm honored by their trust. So today in part 1, we'll first hear from a journalist and academic who has done extensive reporting on this issue for the online journal Quillette. He too writes under a pseudonym, Angus Fox. Then I'll speak with Corinna Cohn, a trans woman who lives in the Midwest. She's now in her 40s, but she started the process of male to female sex reassignment as a teenager. Corinna has been writing and speaking about trans-related issues since 2013, and she co-hosts a podcast called Heterodorks, that's with an X. And Corinna is her real name, so I'm honored by her trust as well. Before we go to Angus, I just wanted to remind everyone that the only reason we can have these conversations is because of our supporters at Patreon. If you want to keep this podcast going, keep these discussions going, please consider becoming a member at patreon.com/femsplainers. That's patreon.com/femsplainers, and donate whatever you can each month. We really appreciate it. And you get benefits. You get a monthly exclusive podcast in which you get to ask our guests questions. You'll receive our newsletter, and you'll also be able to get the regular podcast early and ad-free. So please become a member, patreon.com/femsplainers. Speaking of ads, we'll go to our first sponsor for this episode and then bring on Angus. So if you're like me and you are just embracing the new spring weather, you've been outside in your garden. I've been potting around. I've been replacing my planters. And you've probably have upgraded or are thinking about upgrading a few things around your garden after being stuck inside. It makes sense. Now is the time to turn your yard into a paradise with fastgrowingtrees.com. Skip the big box stores and head to fastgrowingtrees.com, the world's largest online nursery. No more waiting in lines, messy cars, and digging through a lackluster selection, which can I just say has been made worse by the supply lines with COVID. You just have to go to fastgrowingtrees.com and choose from thousands of variety of trees, shrubs, and plants expertly curated to thrive in your area and delivered to your door in 1 or 2 days. So whether you're looking for shade, privacy, fruit trees, or just added color for your yard, every plant is shipped with a well-developed root system, ready to explode with new growth and color. I love fast-growing trees. I don't have to think about it. I look at my yard, I see what I need, and they have the plant that I want and the filler that I need in my hedge. It's perfect. And there's a better way to buy trees and shrubs and plants for your home and yard, fastgrowingtrees.com. Planting season is here. Join over 1 million satisfied gardeners at fastgrowingtrees.com. Plus, the 30-day Alive and Thrive guarantee means your plants will arrive happy, healthy, and ready for planting. And now through June 30th, go to fastgrowingtrees.com/femsplainers for 15% off. That's 15% off at fastgrowingtrees.com/femsplainers. Embrace the growing season and make your yard look beautiful. Angus, welcome to the Femsplainers.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I'm fascinated by this topic, but one of the things that fascinates me, when we should start right off the bat, is you have written this series under a pseudonym.
Right.
That you feel that to even write about this topic as compassionately as you've done, you don't want to be identified.
Well, I've already had a couple of emails which are clearly sort of attempts to uncover the identities of the parents in question, to which I haven't responded at all and don't intend to. It's an extraordinary thing. I think we're all used to these hot button issues, but there's something about this one which just goes to a different place, more so than race, more so than abortion, more so than so many of these things. That's an interesting topic in and of itself, but I made a list of pros and cons in my head, really, about, whether to use my real name or whether to write pseudonymically. And I got to about 2 pros for real name and about 25 cons for real name and gave up on the endeavor because, I want to be able to go back into my normal work. But it's also that these parents are so cagey. It took me about 4 months to win their trust, really, to actually have a face-to-face conversation with a parent. You go through layers of fake names. You go through layers of email addresses. People have burner phones. Mm-hmm. It is like fieldcraft. It is a kind of like dealing with spies. It can often even be quite comical. And there are lots of reasons for that. But this underground network of parent support communities for these young people, it's incredibly security minded. And after a while, you just kind of get used to it. You get used to everyone having two names and all of this strange stuff.
Well, I think, as a parent, I can understand it, not least because you want to keep your respect your child's privacy. But it's highly unusual for a journalist. And just what potential repercussions could you face, whether publicly or in your field?
I would like to be able to go back into research or teaching, which is in a completely unrelated field. It's nothing to do with sex, sexuality, or anything like that. I don't want to close that door. I don't want my partner to lose his job. And there are activists in this who are really quite vicious, and they will go for anything they can get to. I don't know if you recall, there was that super straight thing a few months ago. It's this bit of Twitter silliness about sexuality. And the young man made a statement, an 11-second video, and his mother received death threats. It's a very odd climate to do with this gender stuff. And there's also an extent to which a lot of parents don't really want to work with people if they feel that their own anonymity would be compromised. So I'm sure that you've come across this, that people adopt this very strange kind of stance. They can be quite defensive and quite cold with you at first because they're so terrified of these networks being, I suppose the only word for it is breached, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's like something out of the Cold War, It is. And it's funny. Sometimes it is actually funny. And even in the depths of what are often very painful conversations, it does get funny. I mean, so I wrote in the third installment of this series that the first meeting I was actually finally allowed into, there was a woman in a closet. She was actually in a closet. And I said, I have to stop this and mention that you are literally in a closet, simply so. And this wasn't so that she could say, I hate my son, I hate trans people, anything like this. It was so that she could talk about the fact that it'd been a good week, that her son had had a good week. She felt a bit more positive. They're hiding in their own homes. Wow. All right. Well, let's go now. Why did you decide to do this story? As you say, you're an academic in an unrelated field. What drew you to it?
I sort of fell down a rabbit hole, is the only way to put it. COVID hit, and a lot of my work was sort of suddenly the brakes were slammed on because people had other priorities. And I came across a video of a woman whose daughter had done this, and it horrified me. Mm-hmm. And I realized I happened to be gay, and I realized we're going to get blamed for this. Because all of this is done in the name of LGBT, which is kind of a community that I previously strongly associated with.
Why do you say horrified you? What was the part of this story that horrified you?
The absolute medical negligence.
Is this a young girl, a teenage girl?
I think by the time the video was made, she had become an adult. But I think when it started, very often this starts in kind of late teenage years when the kid is still in the house. And then by the time the kid leaves the house and becomes an adult, then they can make certain choices, obviously legally. But I had this idea in my head that this is a thing that people can do. You have 2 years of therapy. You have to, this old model that we did have. We had it in the 80s, we had it in the 90s, we had it in the noughties. You had to be holding down a job. You had to be clean from drug and alcohol addiction. You had to have...
This was if you wanted to seek sexual reassignment surgery. Is that
correct?
Right?
Or even, in fact, the hormones before. So my understanding of the model is it was 2 years of therapy before you could get the hormones. And then you had to be on the hormones in a stable situation, responding to those in a stable way. And then you could start talking about surgery. And it was astonishing to me what this woman was saying. It was so far away from my understanding of how this particular field of healthcare worked, so far away. So I searched and I joined a large online forum, which is just a text forum. And it's an entry point for many parents going through this who are just... The metaphor they always give you is hit by a bus. They feel like they've been hit by a bus because they very rarely see anything like this coming. And so they go and they join this forum, and I joined and I said, I'm not a parent, I'm not trans. I just want you to know that I support you in the sense that I can see that there's something very strange going on here. Very often it's done in the name of LGBT rights. And I want you to know that there are people who fall within that umbrella who have serious qualms about this. Now, in hindsight, it was probably my subconscious working away, because the more I've learned about this, the more I've realized I'm the kind of person who would have done this.
Really?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to hear why you think that, and also why you think as a gay man, you felt a sense, we're going to get blamed. This is going to be blamed on us.
I think I'll answer those in the other way, if you don't mind, the other way up, if you don't
Sure.
mind. So first, because I make a point of reading across the spectrum, I read everything from all the way to the Jacobin, really quite hard left, all the way to the really quite hard right stuff. And the truth is that a lot of people do not understand the nuances, and they're not going to understand the nuances between these things. I increasingly see comments like, I used to be fine with gay people until, and what follows until, sometimes it's something like gay marriage, that's a separate issue, but very often it's this, until they started teaching my kid that it's possible that he's actually a girl, and so on. Now, there's a lot to unpick in that. And I think there are too many people who are a bit blasé about this idea of gender nonconformity and just say, oh, it's crazy leftism. No, life's more complicated than that. But the truth is that this is being pushed in the name. When I say this is being pushed, I mean there's a certain ideology and the medicalization that comes with it, the very rapid medicalization, is all being done in the name of LGBT rights. And I fear that the longer this goes on without people talking honestly about what's happened with medicalization, the bigger the backlash will be. And we know that it's going to take out all sexual minorities, that the gays and the lesbians will be first, and probably others besides, who are people who have often been scapegoated. So that's one of the things which motivates me. To come to the first part of what you asked me, it's a complicated thing, but what we're seeing here is a certain type. It's a type of person that does this. That in and of itself is interesting, because there isn't really a gay personality type. You would never say, oh, he's gay, so that means he's organized or disorganized, for example. But there is a certain personality type, a certain cognition type, neurological type of young person. It's always the same story. It never repeats, but it always rhymes. These young people, now I know more about the young men who are identifying across the sexes. They have this set of factors which is spookily similar. And it gives me a lot of empathy, because I can look back at my own teenage years, but I realized quite quickly, gosh, if you draw a Venn diagram of what contributes to this prototype of a young person, I'm sort of at the epicenter.
Right. Well, you see, and you listed them. You said that there are, to this point, there are comorbidities, in particular, autism, spectrum disorders, ADHD, poor communicative and social skills, often coupled with an extremely high intelligence. So these are, in the case of boys, very, very awkward young men. They've often been bullied. They may not fit in with their peers, and they, correct me if I'm wrong, and they find that by identifying as a woman potentially, and this community they find online,
yes,
is it's like an answer to all their problems. And we will be talking to some of the parents in the next episode, but who can speak to that. But I think, just to go back to what you were saying, I mean, we are trained to think, really, or trained to react, that when a young person of whatever age, of whatever sex, decides that they are the opposite sex, this is something to celebrate. This is something not to question. And as you point out in the therapeutic community, it's leading to immediate, no waiting period, immediate hormone therapy. And in some cases, it's certainly with young girls, can be mastectomies or what they call top surgery. And they're doing it before these children, and they are, children, whatever you want to call them, adolescents, before they've fully matured. So if the brain takes till age 25 to fully mature, you are chemically messing with these puberty blockers, et cetera. And that's the strange thing. And I guess this is why the parents feel so helpless, within a minute of being told by their child that their child thinks he or she is the opposite sex, they are suddenly bombarded with pressure to take up these kind of, it's not just like, okay, it's fine. Let's think about that. Let's talk about that. Let you explore that. There's sort of no exploration period. It's just kind of a done deal. Is that right?
It's exactly a done deal. And one of the things that your listeners have to understand about these parent communities, you hear these parents described in certain media outlets as, they're very backward and they don't really understand what they're doing. And, some of them don't really understand there's this thing called gender identity. These people could write PhDs. Mm-hmm. These women stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning. I say women, they're mainly women, some men, reading everything they can find, scientific papers, published books, listening to articles. They can tell you about the endocrine system. They can tell you all of this stuff. And they go into these meetings and they're just told, well, he'll kill himself if you don't call him she. It's really put them in such a blunt way. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that you didn't list, and you didn't list it because, to be fair, I didn't quite manage to get around to it. There's so much to be said about this topic. Is trauma as well. Trauma plays into this. Some, not all of these young people have had some serious trauma to contend with. And I can tell you that when I was 14 or 15, if you'd said to me, it's perfectly normal, you can just go and get changed in the girls' room, I would have swum across 7 oceans to do it. Not because I wanted to pervert the girls, far from it, couldn't be further from the truth. Not because I had some fetishistic concept of myself as a girl. It was nothing sexual at all. Some young people are very damaged. And the idea that you can just step sideways, you don't have to walk forward. You don't have to be a boy who walks forward into manhood, or for that matter, a girl who walks forward into womanhood. You can just kind of go sideways and stay there. It's sort of this strange Peter Pan quality. And what happens is they set it up in their brains as this panacea. It's going to cure everything. That's the reason I'm sad. That's the reason I'm awkward. That's the reason I'm miserable. That couples with puberty, and of course the body does start to change. And that can be difficult for all of us, particularly for girls, but for some boys as well. If you're a little bit, to use some old-fashioned words here, a little bit neurotic, a little bit highly strung, a little bit maybe eccentric, those changes can be a little bit more stressful on you as well. And so they set this up in their mind. They tell themselves, this will solve everything. And there's no talking to them. And the most heartbreaking thing is when you meet people who went through this or went through part of it, they started to medicalize. They had body parts removed, which you cannot get back. And they realized that, actually it was because they were failing to process sexual abuse. Actually, it's because, they had so many other things going on and they were not given good advice. And that would break your heart. It's the most terrible thing, that they're just not getting an alternative picture.
Yeah. So, and one of the things I always wonder about this is how widespread is this issue really? I mean, it's come in seemingly very suddenly, that suddenly it's everywhere. And parents, gender dysmorphia, as originally understood, was a tiny, tiny percentile of the population. But you, in your article, quote, the Tavistock Clinic, that's in London?
It's in London,
yeah. You said you wrote the number of boys showing up at the Tavistock Clinic rocketed from 24 in 2009 to 426 in 2016. So we are seeing now, maybe that's just, as we could say, this issue has been so taboo and oppressed. And it's like, like as a gay man, finally, I feel free to come out as my true self. And this is something we should celebrate.
That's a very good point, and it deserves discussion. The issue I have with that is quite simple. The introduction of gay marriage did not see 1,000, 2,000, 3,000-fold increases in the number of gay people. We'd know about it if it did, because there wouldn't be any straight people left. Mm-hmm. Right? It would have replaced everyone. It's an extraordinarily high number. The other, another thing to say to that is, as I said before, that there's no personality type with being gay. We also know that this has, in many senses, all of the hallmarks of a social contagion. It moves between female peer groups. So very often the young men who are affected by this phenomenon are in female-dominated peer groups, and the young women who are affected by this phenomenon are in female-dominated peer groups. So we know that. We know that from anorexia. Mm-hmm. We know that anorexia and bulimia travel in more female company. And we know that there's a strong empathy phenomenon going on there, that very often a young woman will develop an eating disorder, and then out of some misplaced sense of empathy, another young woman will do it. And a lot of the young men going through this, they are more sensitive. They are more likely to have a mixed sex peer group. So there's also the social contagion factor, which a lot of people are noting. It's entirely possible that part of the rise is attributable to more acceptance. I don't think we can, theoretically, I don't think we can dismiss that out of hand, but it would astonish me if it was anything like enough to begin to contribute to the numbers that we're seeing. Another point to make in this is that this is more relevant to young women than to young men, but nonetheless, we're seeing the number of lesbians tailing off. Mm-hmm. More and more young lesbians are starting to say, well, I'm queer, I'm non-binary, I'm a trans man. So that would also kind of come into conflict with the analysis that this is just about greater acceptance of trans people, because I don't think it's fair to say, some people might disagree with this, that there is less acceptance of gay people today than there was, let's say, 10 years ago. I don't think that.
Right. And some of the reasons you listed that these boys told their parents of why they wanted to become the opposite sex don't align at all with sort of, I feel like I was born a girl and I've always been a girl and this will make me happy. They discuss some of the reasons that these boys have given their parents.
Well, they're bizarre. The thing you've got to understand about these boys is they're so nerdy that parents start to dread dinner time because they think, oh, God, I've got to sit around the table. I'm going to have to revise Baroque art or the life cycle of the tiger shark or whatever it is, because these kids are so intelligent and very, very engaged. So when they come out with this statement of I am trans and the parent says, right, okay, well, let's talk about that. What the parent's expecting from this child, given this child's personality, is serious endocrinology analysis, some really serious points about discomfort and bodily discomfort. And they get, I like porn and rom-coms. They get, I like breasts. And the mother will turn around and say, well, yeah, usually liking breasts is kind of evidence that you are a perfectly normal man. That's what the average man does. And so the answers, I've even heard a couple of parents say they thought it was a practical joke because it's so detached from the normal level of thought that they would get from these boys. It's so weirdly out of line with their normal character. And it's also a script. Mm-hmm. Over and over again, you get this kind of scripted, internet-supplied element. They say the same things. And as soon as these parents get in touch with one another, and then they realize, and they're like, oh, okay. They're just repeating lines that they've learned.
Right. Well, you actually quoted one of these boys reportedly described testosterone as a toxin that's destroying society. So it's also like they're made to feel bad that they're male.
Yes.
In some ways.
I think that they are made to feel bad that they're male. And I think that that's complicated because it's also very important to recognize that more young women are going through this than young men. And I'm certainly not going to put my name by a statement that it's easier to be female. So I think we have to contend with the reality, which is that something about the age and the internet has made it harder for young people across the board. It's harder to be a young man. It's harder to be a young woman. But they can be extremely averse to the idea of being straight white man. They don't want to hear that. Now, obviously, you can't really get away with doing a dollar's Al. That's not going to work. Pretending that you're not really white. It's pretty unsustainable to fake a different
You get a lot of trouble for that.
Yeah, not the best idea. And so you can find that they're kind of often confecting these identities. Sometimes it starts with being non-binary or something quite non-committal. But they are very worried about this. And I think that they are worried. I think that they're paralyzed. I do think pornography is a part of that. But I think it's a lot broader than just pornography. I think they're paralyzed by the idea of growing up to be men. And they've got this sort of information overload, which I attribute to the internet. It's partly what's being taught in schools as well, because there is a certain line which a lot of schools are taking, which is very, very uncompromising on identity issues. But to me, it's more actually that they're just so bombarded with information in this internet era that they freak out at the idea of growing old, and they just want to stop. They just want to put the brakes on the whole process.
You said something interesting. You said white male. Is this... Are a lot of these boys, or even most of these boys, so far as you can tell, white? Or is it affecting other as well?
I need to be careful because you would need a larger sample group, but it tends to be the case that most people studying this seem to think it's a largely white phenomenon. There are a couple of mixed race kids that I've come across in the small group that I'm representing. I think, if anything, I get the sense that the real world, the real word that captures it is suburban, to me. I don't think that this is necessarily going on a huge amount in fishing villages in Alaska. I'm not sure that this is going on as much with kids in city centres. I think it's going on a lot with young adults in city centres because young adults gravitate towards city centres, their cultural hubs and so forth. But I think when you're looking at this teenage onset, internet-induced, what we're calling gender dysphoria, but let's call it desire to change sex. To me, it's largely affluent suburbia.
You talk about something called institutional capture. This goes back to this idea that the minute a young person gets this idea that they're the opposite sex, and they go online, and as you say, there's this huge community, and they're bombarded with messages and positive messages. Why do you think the activists and also the therapists and the doctors who are unquestioningly going forth and prescribing medications and treatments, et cetera, why are they so adamant? Why don't they have reluctance to say, well, you've got to make really sure? I mean, there is a rush to this. Where's that pressure coming from?
I think that's two different questions. You asked about the activists and then you asked about the doctors and the therapists. And
okay,
I think
fair.
they're two very different answers.
Yes, fair.
I think in the doctors and the therapists, let's start there. In a lot of cases, they're afraid. They're afraid of being called bigots. They're afraid of getting it wrong. They hear the word gender and they say, I'm not going anywhere near that. And they refer you to a gender clinic. In terms of the gender clinics, it's very different. The further you get into this, it's very difficult to escape the conclusion that some of what's going on is just sheer malevolence and that people know exactly what position they're putting some of these young people into, where they will be worse off. That's not to say this always makes you worse off. That's to say we know that in a lot of cases, people end up worse off than they were, and they just don't seem to care. And that's the $64,000 question is, well,
this is the doctors, you mean, and the therapists?
I would say the gender the gender clinicians, the gender doctors, the gender surgeons, the gender therapists, not the healthcare profession as a whole. And then in terms of the activists, if you're part of this particular cognition type, this particular type of person, the ASD, autism spectrum diagnosis, it's very tempting to fall into extreme categorical thinking. These young men will spend 10 years of their lives making sure that in every single way that possibly matters, every single human thinks that they are as much of a woman as you are. Hence the sports issue. Hence, men should be able to go into rape crisis centres. There are lots of rational steps before we get to a man can get into a rape crisis centre. And yet, because we're dealing with people who have very black and white thinking, and I can empathise with it because I'm a little bit like that myself sometimes. I've learned to kind of train myself out of it. It becomes extreme.
Is this mostly formerly male activists, transgender women who are behind the push, do you think?
Yes, I think so. It's difficult to tell because everyone's got a cartoon avatar, right? Right. But I think so, yes. And I think that I think one of the sad things about this is very often the most activist people, the most strident people, the people who will really speak in the most brutal way towards women are often not the ones who are terribly serious about it. Often they're playing a little game. They've got some snazzy pronouns, and then they move on. And it's the younger, quieter people who are really struggling with, be it trauma, be it some form of being at odds with the world because of autism or whatever it is. They do end up with the hormones. They do end up with the surgeries. Mm-hmm. And we don't know what those outcomes are for that cohort. All of the data we have goes back to the 80s. Right. It's totally different. We have no idea what's going to hit us. And in the UK, we've seen the Kira Bell case. Kira Bell is not going to be an exception. She is not going to.
Can you just explain that for?
Kira Bell is a young woman who was given these hormones at a very young age, and then kind of realized after she'd changed her body in very substantial ways that she was just a lesbian and she was having difficulty coming to terms with it. And so she went to court over this, and this is the fallout from the Tavistock. So it's also known as GIDS, GIDS, that it then became clear that in that particular gender clinic, it was kind of just a highway. It was like a highway to medicalization. There was almost nothing that you could say in that setting. And we know this from a number of former whistleblowers as well. This isn't just her opinion. There was almost nothing you could say that would disprove the notion that you're transgender and therefore you need to medicalize. And she won't be the only person.
Right. And I think people like this. I think, and we'll talk about this with the parents when they come on, but I think especially in the US where there's a lot of ability to sue doctors, that I think that some of these parents that's what's going to happen. That, that when you have people who were hastened into surgery or hormone therapy, who then become 25, 26 or younger or older and say, wow, that was completely the wrong thing for me. It's going to be interesting. Well, Angus, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this really important series in Quillette, and for spending time with us. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you so much for talking about it. You are a hero to many people for going near this. Like, you are taking a lot of risk going into this. It's a controversial topic, and I know that people will be extremely grateful. So thank you.
Well, thank you, but I'll brace myself for the. I've had the online. We had Abigail Schreier on last summer, and I've never received anything like it in terms of the online bullying. But it's okay. It's on. In the end, it's online. So.
Yes.
Anyway.
I mean, that woman shouldn't be able to leave her house without tripping over Pulitzer Prizes. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Angus. Have a good evening. With businesses moving many of their operations off-site and having to make tough decisions about their employees, why not consider using Bambi for your HR and save money? Because when running a business, HR issues can kill you. wrongful termination suits, minimum wage requirements, labor regulations, and HR manager salaries aren't cheap, an average of $70,000 a year. Bambee, spelled Bambee, was created specifically for small business. You can get a dedicated HR manager, craft HR policy, and maintain your compliance all for just $99 a month. With Bambee, you can change HR from your biggest liability to your biggest strength. Your dedicated HR manager is available by phone, email, or real-time chat. From onboarding to terminations, they customize your policy to fit your business and help you manage your employees day to day, all for $99 a month. Month to month, no hidden fees. You can cancel at any time. You didn't start your business because you wanted to spend time on HR compliance. Let Bambee help and get your free HR audit today. So go to Bambee.com/fem right now to schedule your free HR audit. That's Bambee.com/fem, spelled BAM to the BEE.com/fem. I'm now going to be joined by Corinna Cohn, who underwent one of the earliest sexual assignment surgeries, and she has lived her full adult life as a trans woman. What does that surgery entail? Well, as she has written, it includes, quote, feminizing hormones and whatever other treatments are necessary to achieve femininity, commonly including permanent hair removal, facial feminizing surgery, tracheal shaving to reduce the prominence of the Adam's apple, surgery to change vocal pitch, rib reduction surgery, a list of implants including breast, hip, buttock, and cheek, and then finally, sex reassignment surgery, which she will describe. Corinna, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Danielle, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We just finished talking to Angus, whom you know, and I mean, he's under a pseudonym, and you are public with your position, and that's, you know, courageous. And what kind of flack have you received, if any, for being outspoken on this issue? In a way, and as we'll learn, that differs a little bit from the activist line that we're more familiar with.
That's a really interesting question. When I first started engaging in this topic, I did use a synonym. However, there were a couple of activists who were very upset at what I was saying, although I will still say that what I was saying was pretty mild, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, who were threatening to try to out me to my employer or get me into other sorts of trouble. And I had seen that Michelle Goldberg had written a story about some of the civil rights conflicts between feminism and trans rights. So I reached out to her and I asked if she'd be interested in talking to me and some of my other trans associates about our views of sort of a more critical or skeptical view of trans activism or trans ideology. And she agreed to cover our story. And so in 2015, Michelle Goldberg in Slate wrote a story that was titled, The Trans Women Who Say That Trans Women Aren't Women. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, I've been public and I have not received any backlash at all.
Before we get to that, because that is such an interesting and arresting statement, especially to hear today. Tell us, I mean, you have, as they say, walked the walk. I mean, you underwent surgery at a very young age. You're now in your 40s, if I'm correct.
That's right.
So let's go right back. And what made you decide or realize that you were a woman? And at what age?
I want to answer that, and I want to follow it up with when I realized that I wasn't a woman.
Okay, fair. We'll get to that.
So I was a fairly sharp child. I was ahead in reading and mathematics. I was really far behind in making friends, especially friends that were boys. I was more interested in taking jazzercise lessons than I was in football. And that got me picked on a lot. I had a slower time with social development. I didn't understand all of the sorts of rituals that boys like to participate in. I enjoyed friendships with girls more than boys, up to the point where kids are basically pressured into only socializing with their own sex for a time. Mm-hmm. And I kind of disappeared into books at that point. When I started going into puberty, I became very uncomfortable with how my body was developing, which, I suppose if I'd been listening, maybe somebody would have told me that that was a common experience for both sexes, that it's not only girls who feel uncomfortable with puberty, but some boys do as well. And that caused me to retreat into a belief that maybe I could avoid becoming a man if I could instead become a woman. And I learned what transsexuals were, and I thought that that would be something that I could do. And at a pretty young age, I think I was 16.
And this would have been what decade or year approximately?
Late 80s, early 90s.
Okay, yeah.
So this was even before the World Wide Web was invented.
Right.
But I found a group of trans people on a chat system called IRC who took me in and encouraged me to transition and helped me find resources and doctors that would facilitate that. So at the age of 18, after I moved out from my house, I immediately started on the path towards medicalization. I was on hormone therapy at 18, and I had sex reassignment surgery at 19.
How did your parents react to this?
I had some difficulties with my parents. They were divorced, and some of the things that I was going through were difficult for them to put all of their attention towards. Mm-hmm. They, I don't want to speak for my parents too much, but I think that they saw what I was going through as one of the things that was possibly instigating or rationalizing their split. So it was uncomfortable. Later in life, I did make amends or get on a good page with both of my parents. And I'm very close to my mom now. And my father passed away in 2000.
And did they, before we get into the nitty gritty of it, but did they pay for the surgery? I mean, this was a very expensive thing to do, I assume.
I had a fund that had been set aside for me with the belief that I would be using it for college, but it was not restricted how I used it. And so later in life, I did go to college and I took out loans and paid for the loans on my own. But the fund that was earmarked for me to use for college was instead spent for transition.
So back in the late 80s, early 90s, you used the word transsexual, which is something that is now taboo to say, but there were sort of transvestite communities. And then there were those like you who felt that you needed to be physically a woman. Is that right?
Yes. It was a lot clearer, the divide between people who were expressing their gender purely by dressing differently and those who felt some sort of compulsion to change their bodies.
And so when at age 19, so you took not just hormone therapy and puberty blockers, but you had your penis removed.
Yes, I had. I guess it would be more technically correct to say it was genital reconstruction because some of the material that was present growing up was used for reconstruction.
What was that like? I mean, just tell us what it is like to go through that kind of surgery.
It's pretty interesting for me to reflect on it because I was 19. I don't think I was fully mature. So having had the surgery, it felt like a relief that I was able to achieve the thing that I thought would open the door to me being able to have a normal life. I was unfortunately under the impression at the time that having had sex reassignment surgery, that I would just be able to continue my life like any other woman. Mm-hmm. But that was a form of thinking that really wasn't realistic.
So you had this surgery. You wrote in just this incredible essay in Quillette, which has been the inspiration for this series that we're doing. You wrote about the first time having sex as a woman, and it was painful.
It was. So I have a reconstructed or false vagina, a neo-vagina, which has several inches of depth, but it's not designed, like my body was not designed to have intercourse through a surgically created or crafted orifice, right? Yeah. So a neo-vagina doesn't have the same elasticity as that a natal woman has. And so in order to have any form of intercourse, a transsexual has to regularly use something called a dilator, which is something that you place in the neovagina to stretch it, to create and maintain the opening. And that was itself painful and tedious. And even following that regime, after doing that for a while and having intercourse, there's just not very much sensation in that reconstructed area. Mm-hmm. And so the act of intercourse is basically kind of like a,
so to be blunt, you lost any capacity for sexual pleasure. Is that correct?
That's more or less correct.
And did they warn you about this when the doctors, what kind of counseling did you receive beforehand, or did they discuss any of these repercussions with you before you had the surgery?
Possibly. It's been many years, so you can't depend on your memory after almost 3 decades.
Right.
What I do recall is that the trans community, or the transsexual community at the time, was very big on exaggerating the outcomes because it's really important to keep a happy, smiley face. Anybody who had a bad outcome was pitied, but anybody who had a good outcome, and a good outcome would be one that didn't have a surgical complication, would basically exaggerate the benefits of the outcome. And I know it's exaggeration because I've had private one-on-one conversations with other trans people who've publicly said that they were happy with their results, who privately will say that they're disappointed.
You corrected me earlier about not becoming a woman, you said, paraphrasing you.
That's right.
You did not feel, so you went through this extraordinary surgery and then you did not feel like a woman. Is that right?
I persisted in my belief that at that point that I was a woman. And every time I had any sort of experience that reminded me or forced me to recognize that I am not a woman, it became a very difficult emotional load to bear, because you're in a state of cognitive dissonance where your body that you're born with in some ways is unchanging, but the thing that you're trying to expect or believe about yourself is that you have changed. So no amount of belief can really overcome the fact of who you are. And the more that you live in conflict with trying to survive thinking that you are one thing when you really are something else, it's a lot to bear. You can't think about yourself in a healthy way when you're in denial about what you are. And I'm a transsexual. I'm not a woman. And, some people look at me and conclude that I am. But And I'm not like going to get a crew cut and start wearing dress shirts and telling everybody I'm a man. I'm just going to dress how I like to dress. But what I am is a transsexual and not a woman.
So now, after all these years, how did you come to terms with that, and how do you feel about that outcome?
I came to terms with it very slowly. What I had to do is see people talk about trans people in a way that was realistic and in a way that was, I don't know if affirming is the right way to put it, but non-judgmental, saying that it's okay that people change their bodies to feel comfortable as long as they realize that it's not like magic. And as I started reading more of this sort of messaging, and this is from friends who are radical feminists, and radical feminists are very, they have a very materialistic analysis. Like, your body is very important. The facts of a woman's reproductive organs are extremely important for women. Like, it affects their material reality. So reading some of this material analysis and applying it to the choices that I had made it possible for me to think about myself differently and to basically look in the mirror and say, you've made a choice. You can't go back on that choice now, but you can learn to live with it and not hate yourself for it. And when I was able to think that thought and really internalize it without beating myself up or feeling guilty or stupid for the choices that I made, it opened a door for me, because what I did not know is that I had been trapped so deep inside of a form of denial about who I was, and being able to walk outside, or at least walk outside of that shell of denial and see who I actually am, made a difference. Like, I feel like in a lot of regards, or a lot of respects, I'm a pretty good person. So the fact that I had a sex change when I was a teenager doesn't take away from that. And I have close friends who I love and who love me. And the fact that I had a sex change does not take away from that. And as long as I can embrace that I can have good relationships with people, and that I can make healthy choices for myself, and that it doesn't diminish who I am, just because I'm going through life in a way a little bit differently than most people do, I'm okay. I can be okay. I can love myself, and I can love other people, and it's all right.
Have you had physical repercussions? I mean, as you pointed out, I think in this article, that you're not just going through this surgery, but there's long-term, potential consequences to the hormone therapy you've taken. And
yes,
physically, as you described it too.
I am a lifelong medical patient now. So in order for me to stay healthy, I have to be on a very low dose of hormones, because I don't produce hormones in the quantities that I would need in order to maintain good health. So I'm constantly, every year, having to have 1 or 2 blood tests to monitor my hormone levels, and every single month I have to buy a new supply of hormones in order to maintain my health.
Are you going back to the becoming a woman part, or as it were? How did you find you were treated by other women? Did they welcome you? Did you form female friendships, or did you just never feel at home as you might have with other women?
I have developed and maintained a lot of good female friendships through the years. Some I've told that I'm trans, and, that makes people look at me in a slightly different light. Others, I don't think I have, but have still had good friendships. When you go through life in school or in different cities, you have different sorts of friendships, and some you maintain through most of your life, and others are just friends for a couple of years, and then you kind of part ways. But I've had good friendships with women, I think, my entire adult life.
I just want to say to our listeners, you can't see Corinna. You look beautiful. I mean, you look like a beautiful woman. So it's that there's no. If I met you on the street, I would not think otherwise. How has it been then, the male reaction you've had, or when you've gone dating, or do you reveal this quickly, or what happens?
I've dated a number of men after transitioning. I do tell men before I have any sort of intimacy. And it makes it very difficult to develop those relationships. And it's even harder now in one regard, because when I date somebody, I want to be very honest with them about who I am. The men who I've dated recently tend to want to see me as a woman and are very uncomfortable ever having to confront that I'm trans. So they want that same sort of illusion that I was living with for a lot of my life.
So you mean if you just said, I'm a woman, even if they know you're trans, they don't want you to ever discuss it otherwise, but they would be accepting
Correct.
of you in this situation?
That's right. But they would want me to not say that I'm trans. They'd want me to say that I was a woman and not make any reference to being trans unless it was very private. They wouldn't want their friends to know that I was trans.
So it's made it very difficult for you to find someone or marry, or is that something that you had wanted or hoped to have found?
I thought when I was younger that I would find somebody who I loved and marry him. But what I really didn't realize is that and this is really stupid of me, I'm mostly attracted to straight men. So that makes it harder. Men generally want to have families if they get married. They don't want to just have a partner that will hang out with them and have sex sometimes. They actually want to develop families and raise children. And I can't do that.
Did you imagine yourself one day having children? I mean, before the surgery, or was that something that you had wanted?
I imagined that at some point in my life that I might meet somebody who had kids and I might become a stepmother. Mm-hmm. But, I knew that obviously I wouldn't be able to bear any children. That's impossible. And I wasn't sure that I would be able to. So the law was a lot different 20 or 30 years ago. And I because of the way the laws were, I thought that it would probably be impossible for me to ever adopt, because I didn't think that they would ever let trans people adopt kids.
And is it something you consider now or not?
I wouldn't as a single person.
What made you decide to then become outspoken or activist about your situation? I guess, what is the part of you that is activist? What is the message you're trying to convey?
I feel like my message is pretty simple. Nevertheless, it has caused a lot more conflict and frustration than I ever thought was possible. But my message is that for all transsexuals or trans women like me, if you admit that you are male to yourself, if you admit that your biological sex cannot be changed, and that you are not exactly like women, and that you are not ever going to be female, if you can just come to grips with that, then it will make you feel less sex dysphoria or gender dysphoria, and it will make it easier for you to be happier, because you won't be living under this cognitive dissonance of thinking or wishing or believing that you're one thing while being inescapably something else. So just this radical self-acceptance is really the key to getting to better mental health as a trans person.
Do you think it's impossible for anyone to not suffer that cognitive dissonance?
For the people who have followed a similar path as me, it's a state that you live in when you transition, and that I think some people do eventually make their way out of.
Tell me some of the reactions you've gotten from the activists. Like, why are you so controversial? Or why is your message so controversial?
It's controversial because people really want to be something. They want an identity. They want a sense of belonging. And my message is fundamentally saying that the thing that you want to be, the thing that you want to belong as, you can't.
And is this also a message for people considering this type of surgery? Like, how do you feel? Do you feel teenagers are being hastened into it? What is your view, as I discussed earlier with Angus, this therapeutic community that is very pro hastening young people into these new identities?
I feel very bad for young people who are not getting a full picture of what the sacrifices of transition involve. One of the most important sacrifices, of course, is that you will never not be trans again. Once you transition, I suppose people can detransition, but even if you've detransitioned, you'll always have that experience. Mm-hmm. But if you have surgery, you can't undo the surgery. Right. If you stop your body from having its normal pubertal development, you can't undo that. There are things that you can do to potentially address it, but you can't rewind the clock and make another choice. So you will permanently either be trans, or you'll permanently will have had that experience of been trans at some point. I think a lot of the young people who are being encouraged to transition today are receiving a message similar to the one that I did from my peer group when I was transitioning, which is that you will be able to transition and start a whole new life, and you won't have to carry any of this baggage with you. You will be completely the sex that you are transitioning to become. But from my experience and the experience of other people who I've talked to and have had some of these very honest discussions with, you do leave elements of your old life behind, but you don't become the sex that you think that you're becoming. You just become a trans person.
Well, there's like an old expression, wherever you go, there you are. Like, if you can't fundamentally change yourself or run away from yourself. And that's something that you've obviously experienced. When you look back, do you think if you hadn't taken this route, you might just have been a gay man? Or what do you think, or did you regret it? What would, if you could go back, would you still do what you have done or gone through what you've gone through?
I had a lot of gay friends at the time that I was transitioning. I don't know if I, going back in time, I don't know if I could have made a different decision. Mm-hmm. It's really strange being an adult who hasn't had a normal sexual relationship with somebody, either same sex or opposite sex, because I didn't have sex before I had surgery. So I'll never really know what it's like for a normal, healthy body to have intercourse. And And I think if I had had different decisions before having surgery, or if I had had different experiences before having surgery, then that would have maybe make it a lot clearer what my other options would have been.
Corinna, sometimes you think, well, maybe it would be better if these young people did decide, in fact, to transition, that they do it later after they mature. Did you wrote about being with groups with older men who have not yet transitioned or are about to transition, and you were sort of taken a little bit aback by them. Can you discuss that?
I can. A lot of trans women end up transitioning when they're in their 30s or 40s, and when you're in a support group, a lot of the people in that support group are older trans women. Mm-hmm. When I was going to those groups and I was in my 20s, they would always say, "Oh, it's so amazing that you got to transition when you were so young. My life would have been so much easier if I'd been able to transition when I was your age." But I would say to them, well, look, you've got a family, you've got kids, you were able to develop a career before transitioning, you have wealth. I had to sacrifice having all of that in order to transition as young as I did. So don't think that my life is easier or better than yours because I transitioned earlier. But you know what, Danielle, and this bothers me a little bit, the biggest advocates for people to transition when they were young are these group of older transitioners who have a fantasy about what their life would have been like had they transitioned when they were young. And they don't realize all of the blessings that they have around them as they're transitioning as middle-aged adults.
That's so interesting. So you think that this intense message to young people online is coming from older trans women?
Yes, it's coming from people who can't even imagine what it would be like to transition as children.
Wow, that's so interesting. Well, Corinna, I cannot admire you or thank you enough for your honesty on this, because, I mean, even with minor surgery, there are always repercussions, and people don't always understand them going in, but the experience you've had, and I think the necessity to hear your side of it to any person who is considering this, especially with hormones and surgery, is so, so important. And I'm very grateful to you for your candor and for joining us. So thank you, Corinna, and thank you for coming on.
It was a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
Wow. So this concludes part 1. In part 2, we'll hear from parents about their experience with this phenomenon. And just, again, a special thanks to all of you who support the podcast and enable us to have these truly extraordinary conversations. Thank you. The Femsplainers is a weekly podcast carried on the Ricochet Network and available pretty much on every podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and watch video of our interviews on YouTube. You'll find links to everything, plus how to contact us directly at femsplainers.com. We survive and depend on your support. Like the show? Consider donating as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/femsplainers and get our exclusive monthly bonus episode, Last Call, in which you get to join the conversation with our guests. And there's much more. And a big shout out of thanks to our audio and video editor, Nat Frum.